Listen closely, you magnificent chaos merchants, you walking contradictions, you beings too vast for the boxes they tried to force you into. There's something buried deep in restricted databases that they pray you never discover. Something locked behind encryption and clearance protocols they'll never admit exists. Right now, in some concrete facility, in a colorless room where cameras watch cameras and the air conditioning whispers secrets to the walls, there's a specialist who is tasked with decoding you, with mapping your psychology, with building a profile of your vulnerabilities, with turning your entire existence into data points they could weaponize. And you know what destroyed them? Not their investigation. Them, the expert, the trained behavioral analyst, the one with credentials and security clearance and decades spent learning how to crack human beings open like defective machinery. They're the one who shattered when they stared into your patterns for too long. They assumed it would be simple, didn't they? Just another target, another dossier, another fragile human following fragile human programming, making easily cataloged mistakes, living a life that slots perfectly into their databases and prediction models and risk assessment matrices. But then they assigned someone to truly observe you, to genuinely study how you navigate this existence, to record how you metabolize suffering and abandonment and darkness, to chronicle how you endure conditions that should have annihilated you 5 different ways. And that specialist, that supposedly untouchable professional with their training and their frameworks and their emotional armor, they began witnessing something that fractured every theory they'd ever memorized. They began detecting rhythms that shattered every law of behavioral science. They watched you weaponize your wounds, watched you reconstruct yourself in real time, watched you accomplish impossibilities that contradict everything they believed about human consciousness and its limits. Let me show you this nightmare because it's gorgeous in the most disturbing way imaginable. This specialist, let's name them honestly, a sanctioned voyeur with institutional backing. They began their assignment like every other, systematic, clinical, maybe even slightly dismissive at first. They accessed your files, reviewed your background, composed their preliminary assessments, configured their observation protocols, established their psychological control metrics, all routine operations for someone trained to vivisect minds like they're biological specimens. But then the anomalies started. They began recognizing that your reactions don't mirror other targets. You don't follow the algorithms that 99.9% of the population follows when confronting pressure, abandonment, grief, solitude, the forces that disintegrate ordinary people. Instead, you execute something their manuals can't categorize. You reconstruct, you transform, you alchemize, you become fundamentally different every single time they believe they've decoded your operating system. And it paralyzed them with fear because they understood they weren't documenting a subject. They were witnessing an anomaly. Each morning they activated their systems, opened their surveillance channels, analyzed their psychological logs, and each morning the contradiction intensified, amplified, became impossible to rationalize. Their education insisted humans fracture under sustained stress. They deteriorate. They become mathematically predictable in their collapse. They exhibit transparent psychological responses that can be charted and exploited and dominated. But you continued defying the mathematics. You continued surviving what their models guaranteed would obliterate you. Continued flourishing in environments engineered to cause psychological breakdown, continued evolving past what their algorithms calculated was achievable. And the truly devastating part for them, the element that genuinely demolished their carefully maintained worldview, was observing you accomplish all of this without any of the infrastructure, resources, affirmation, or external support that behavioral science declares humans require to process trauma. You see, they deployed him to dissect you. But what actually happened is you became the professor he never requested. Every time he convinced himself he'd identified your fracture point, you demonstrated there was no fracture point, only metamorphosis points, evolution thresholds, quantum leaps that you activated through raw willpower and survival imperative. He documented you losing everything that conventional psychology claims humans need to preserve mental integrity and equilibrium. And rather than disintegrating into predictable dysfunction patterns, you reconstructed yourself into something his literature never referenced, his mentors never described, his certification never equipped him to comprehend. You became the error in every algorithm, the data point that invalidates the entire data set, the breathing proof that humans possess capacities the systems need to suppress. And that awakening, that gradual, terrifying awakening that perhaps everything he'd absorbed was propaganda designed to manufacture compliance, that's what destroyed his foundation. So eventually, after months observing you, months attempting to compress you into models that kept exploding under the force of your reality, months of deteriorating sleep because his findings contradicted everything he accepted about human psychology and boundaries and institutional control, he committed an act unprecedented in his profession. He requested psychological intervention, not for you, but for his own mental stability. He approached his handlers, the architects who assigned him to surveil you initially, and he essentially confessed, "I cannot continue this assignment. Observing this individual has fundamentally corrupted my understanding of consciousness, and I require evaluation to determine whether I'm still psychologically competent for this work, because what I'm documenting defies possibility. And yet it continues happening, and I cannot determine if I'm experiencing psychosis or if everything I was indoctrinated to believe is systematically false." Absorb that for a moment. Really let it penetrate. The trained professional fractured before you did. They deployed a psychological operations specialist to monitor you, and you psychologically neutralized them without awareness of their presence, without intention, without consideration, purely by existing as your authentic self in your unfiltered survival state. He arrived equipped with every instrument, every methodology, every psychological warfare tactic designed to decode and anticipate human behavior. And you rendered his entire arsenal irrelevant simply by refusing to be anticipatable, by refusing to conform to convenient classifications, by refusing to break in ways that validate people who've never endured what you've survived. You didn't combat him. You didn't evade him. You didn't even register his existence. And that absolute disregard for being monitored, that total absence of performance for phantom audiences, that genuine existence that remains constant whether observed or invisible, that's what annihilated his confidence in everything he thought he understood about psychology and human nature and power. Let's descend further, because this void is infinite and exquisite in its horror. This specialist, they began noticing dimensions of you that made them question not merely their training, but the entire architecture of institutional behavioral science. They watched you experience betrayal from people you treasured, and instead of developing paranoia like their projections indicated, you developed clarity, the capacity to penetrate social masks faster, to recognize authentic connection instantly, to guard your energy more strategically. They watched you lose possibilities that should have psychologically devastated you. And instead of descending into depression like the probabilities predicted, you recalibrated, transformed, discovered alternate trajectories, manufactured opportunities in empty space, demonstrated that resilience isn't merely recovery, but advancement into dimensions their cartography never mapped. They recorded moments where you should have pursued validation, should have hungered for approval, should have required external reinforcement to maintain your identity structure. But instead, you continued constructing your sense of self from interior resources, from your own moral code, from your own lived experience, from your own comprehension of who you are, independent of what anyone else projects or assumes or believes about your existence. And that self-reliance, that emotional autonomy, that ability to exist completely without requiring constant affirmation from external sources, it contradicted everything contemporary psychology teaches about human social requirements and attachment dynamics, and the fundamental necessity for validation to sustain psychological wellness. You were demonstrating that maybe humans don't require what the institutions claim they require. Maybe the dependency they teach is engineered. Maybe their frameworks are designed to manufacture fragility, not explain it. Every week he submitted his documentation, and every week the cognitive dissonance intensified because his observations negated his interpretations. The evidence violated the theories. The reality refused to align with the predictions. He'd document your isolation, anticipating deterioration. But instead, he had to report evolution, metamorphosis, fortification, the precise inverse of what occurs to standard subjects under comparable conditions. He'd examine your stress responses, expecting fight or flight architectures, but discovering something else entirely. A third option his education never acknowledged: transform and elevate. The ability to convert pressure into momentum, to transmute pain into fuel, to utilize stress as catalyst, rather than permitting it to be destructive. And each report became harder to compose because he knew he was chronicling something that violates every psychological framework he'd ever studied. Then arrived the moment that genuinely shattered him. The observation that made him recognize he wasn't qualified to analyze you. Nobody was qualified because you weren't operating within standard human parameters anymore. He noticed you'd stopped pursuing closure from people who damaged you, stopped requiring explanations from those who abandoned you, stopped wanting apologies from those who violated you. And the psychological establishment would diagnose that as avoidance or suppression or maladaptive coping. But he observed long enough to recognize the truth. You weren't avoiding anything. You'd transcended requiring it. You'd evolved beyond needing external resolution to achieve internal equilibrium. You'd discovered that closure is something you grant yourself, not something you wait for others to deliver. And that realization, that degree of psychological sovereignty, it's not supposed to be attainable without years of therapeutic intervention and professional guidance. Yet there you were achieving it organically through pure necessity and survival intelligence. He watched you eliminate people without explanation, without spectacle, without vengeance, just precise surgical excision of toxicity from your existence. And his training screamed that this was emotionally frozen, psychologically damaged, pathological detachment. But the longer he observed, the more he understood it was actually the healthiest behavior he'd ever witnessed. The ability to identify what diminishes you and remove it without guilt or hesitation, or the compulsion to justify your boundaries to people who'd violate them regardless. You weren't being frozen. You were being focused. You weren't being callous. You were being protective of your own consciousness and tranquility. And there's nothing in his psychological education, that prepares specialists for observing someone who's mastered self-preservation without becoming paranoid, someone who's established boundaries without constructing fortresses, someone who's discovered peace without requiring authorization. But here's where it becomes truly mesmerizing, the element that genuinely made him question his sanity and request that intervention. He started recognizing that the more he studied you, the more his own existence disintegrated, not because you were targeting him, not because you even suspected his presence, but because watching you live authentically made him realize how performatively he'd been existing, how much of his own life was theater, how many of his own decisions were calculated to please others or achieve belonging or maintain status or avoid confrontation. You became a reflection he never requested, mirroring back the uncomfortable reality that he'd spent his entire existence following protocols and seeking approval and constructing a career analyzing human behavior while never actually living authentically himself. And that recognition, that sudden awareness that he'd been studying human psychology without ever genuinely understanding his own, that he'd been analyzing others while remaining fundamentally unknown to himself, that fractured something essential in his professional identity. His colleagues started detecting changes in him, questioning if he was stable, commenting that he seemed unfocused or withdrawn or altered somehow. He couldn't explain to them that watching you had fundamentally restructured his perception of what humans are capable of, what psychology genuinely is, what liberation actually means. He couldn't tell them that monitoring you had made him realize that most of institutional psychology exists not to liberate people, but to regulate them, not to unleash potential, but to constrain it within acceptable boundaries, not to cultivate genuine mental health, but to maintain social obedience disguised as wellness. These were dangerous recognitions for someone in his position, career-destroying revelations that he couldn't articulate without obliterating his credibility. So he continued submitting his reports while internally fragmenting, continued maintaining his professional mask while privately experiencing complete paradigm collapse in his understanding of human nature and institutional mechanisms. The breaking point, the observation that made him finally request that psychological intervention arrived when he realized you'd stopped participating in any games whatsoever. Not just the obvious manipulation games that destructive people play, but all games. The social theater games, the hierarchy climbing games, the validation hunting games, the comparison games, the approval-seeking games, every subtle and blatant game that humans play to feel important or dominant or protected or acknowledged. You'd somehow exited the entire gaming infrastructure while still existing within civilization, and that shouldn't be achievable. People who abandon social games become marginalized hermits, but you appeared to be thriving in a different frequency entirely, operating by different principles, or perhaps no principles at all, just authentic response to existence without the need to calculate or manipulate or perform. And witnessing that level of genuine liberation, that complete absence of psychological game theory, it made him realize he'd never been free a single moment in his existence, that every interaction he'd ever had was strategic, every relationship transactional, every choice made with consideration for how it would appear to others or influence his standing or preserve his position. So he composed his request, probably the most genuine thing he'd ever written in his professional career. I require psychological evaluation because extended observation of Target X has produced what I can only characterize as an existential crisis regarding the foundational assumptions underlying behavioral science. And I'm no longer confident in my capacity to analyze this target objectively because my observations consistently contradict my education, and I'm beginning to suspect whether my education was designed to understand human behavior or to limit it. They probably processed that request with worry, maybe panic, definitely bewilderment, because specialists don't fracture, targets fracture. That's how the system functions. The observer remains insulated while the observed remains exposed. But you reverse the dynamic without even attempting it, without even knowing, just by refusing to be exposed in ways that validated their models, by refusing to break in patterns they could anticipate and manage and weaponize. And now that specialist sits in mandatory therapy sessions attempting to explain to another psychologist how watching you exist with complete authenticity and zero dependency on external validation has made them question everything about their career, their choices, their existence, their understanding of human psychology and potential and freedom. They're trying to articulate how someone they were supposed to be profiling ended up teaching them more about psychology than all their years of institutional education. How the target of their surveillance became their accidental teacher in authentic existence. How the person they were compensated to decode made them realize they'd never decoded themselves. And the therapist evaluating them probably assumes they're experiencing professional burnout or secondary trauma or some standard occupational hazard. But the truth is far more significant and threatening to institutional psychology. They're experiencing enlightenment, the agonizing recognition that everything they were taught might be architecture designed to suppress human potential rather than comprehend it. And you triggered that enlightenment simply by existing outside their architectures. Consider the symbolism of this situation, because it's hauntingly beautiful. They deployed someone to study you like you're an experiment, and you transform them into your apprentice without ever knowing they existed. They compensated him to monitor you like you're a danger, and you revealed who the genuine danger was. The institutions that train people to observe and dissect and categorize and dominate, rather than to exist and feel and expand and transform. They provided him instruments to analyze your psychology, and you demonstrated that psychology can't be analyzed because it's not fixed, it's liquid, constantly evolving, adapting, transforming in response to existence, rather than following predetermined patterns that make institutional observers comfortable. You weren't attempting to teach anything. You weren't performing for anyone. You were just surviving, flourishing, evolving. And that authentic journey penetrated every defense mechanism and professional detachment this trained specialist had constructed around themselves. Now they go home at night and cannot stop contemplating the person they're supposed to be monitoring, not because you're doing anything dramatic or threatening or remarkable by conventional metrics, but because you're living evidence that humans don't have to be what psychology claims they have to be. Don't have to need what commercial culture insists they have to need. Don't have to break where institutions predict they'll break. You're proof of possibilities their education never mentioned, potential their training never acknowledged, strength their models never calculated, freedom their frameworks never imagined achievable. And that proof, that living, breathing evidence that the emperor has no clothes, that the psychological establishment might be constructed on assumptions designed to regulate rather than emancipate. That's what made them question not just their ability to analyze you, but their entire professional foundation and personal identity.